Good evening, everybody. Thank you for being here tonight, and thank you to everybody who is watching at home. My name is Stephen Woolfolk. I'm the Director of Programming for the Kansas City Public Library, and it's a pleasure to be here tonight. 6 years ago, we hosted Richard Rothstein in this very building for a discussion of his then new book, The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. If you missed that event, or if you haven't read the book, I would encourage you to do so. It's tremendously well done, and it will undoubtedly further your understanding of the topic and add context to what you're going to hear this evening. Because The Color of Law challenged the narrative that white and black Americans chose to segregate and explains how American government at all levels created, often consciously, segregation across the country. But as is often the case with these types of projects, it left readers wondering, what do we do about it? Our guest tonight offers some thoughts on that. Leah Rothstein is the daughter of Richard Rothstein. Together, they co-authored Just Action, How to Challenge Segregation Enacted Under the Color of Law. She spent more than 2 decades as a consultant to affordable housing developers and local governments and as a community and union organizer. In Just Action, the Rothsteins acknowledge movements like Black Lives Matter and the millions of Americans who supported the cause by protesting, flying flags, posting yard signs, etc. But the book goes beyond that and attempts to offer concrete suggestions that can actually address the historical inequities that exist in America. Real solutions based on decades of research. If you've ever said to yourself, this is awful, but I just don't know what we should do, this is the book you need to read. Please join me in welcoming to the Kansas City Public Library, Leah Rothstein.
Hi, good evening. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Steve. It's great to see all of your faces and those of you online that I can't see. So, as Steve mentioned, the book I'm going to talk about tonight, Just Action, is a follow-up to my dad's book, The Color of Law. So I'm going to start by giving a little bit of a summary of The Color of Law, the history of how we came to be a segregated society, and then a bit about what we can do about it now, what we can do to address that reality that we live in. So to start, I'm going to start with this concept of de facto segregation. It's a term we've all likely heard. It's how we have come as a country to describe or explain why we are a racially segregated country, why every metropolitan area around the country is segregated by race, why whites and African Americans live in different neighborhoods in every metropolitan region, in every north, south, east, and west parts of the country. So we tell ourselves, according to this de facto segregation idea, that we are segregated by race not because of public policy or laws, that residential segregation is different from the segregation that occurred in the South, which was required by laws, the segregation of transportation, lunch counters, schools. But we tell ourselves that residential segregation is something different. It's something that happened because of personal preference, that we like to live around people who look like us, and so we self-segregated into racially homogenous communities. Or it's a question of economics, that economic status sort of tracks to race, and so we sort of self-sort by our economic status. Or we tell ourselves that it was because of private actors, bigoted realtors or landlords or mortgage lenders who refuse to rent or sell or give mortgages to African Americans to live in white communities. And we look around and we think, you know, it's too bad that we live like this. It's too bad that our country is so racially segregated, but there's nothing we can do about it because something that happened by accident can only unhappen by accident. We have no agency to affect that reality, to change it or to challenge it. The Supreme Court has agreed with this view over and over again. Chief Justice John Roberts has written in opinions that because the government had no role to play in creating segregation, it has no role to play in undoing it or challenging it. So this de facto idea is extremely pervasive, all the way up to the Supreme Court, from my high school textbooks to the Supreme Court. And so in 2017, my father, Richard Rothstein, wrote The Color of Law to take on that idea that he called the de facto segregation idea a myth. And in The Color of Law, he argued that sure, there were private actors who helped to create residential segregation, but their actions were incentivized and often explicitly required by the government, all levels of government, local, state, federal government, written into government policy manuals that required private actors and public actors to create and perpetuate and maintain segregated communities. So these actions by our government, they're as unconstitutional as the laws that segregated the lunch counters and transportation in schools of the South. They're as much a violation of the 5th and 14th Amendment. And as such, once we recognize that that's how we came to be segregated, these unconstitutional actions of our government, we begin to understand that we have an obligation to do something about it. Because when we reckon with the past like that, when we reckon with our government taking unconstitutional actions, the result is that we then remedy those actions. We do something to step up to the obligation to remedy those past acts. Nobody has yet really on a mass scale taken on that obligation to remedy racial segregation of our country. So I'll give one example from The Color of Law, and that book is filled with detailed examples of government policies all over the country, all levels of government that created and maintained segregation. One of the more well-known examples of this is after World War II, when the federal government helped to subsidize the suburbanization, oh, that's a mouthful, subsidize the suburbanization of the country. And so after World War II, there were millions of war veterans who came home from the war. They started families, we had the baby boom. They were met with a housing shortage because, during the war, there weren't a lot of houses being built. Prior to the war was the Great Depression, when no housing was built either. So these millions of war veterans and their families couldn't find housing because there was a shortage. The federal government wanted to do something about this. So it stepped in to help to build suburbs all around the country to meet the demand for housing. Now, at the time, we weren't a suburban country. We weren't a suburban economy. Most workers lived near urban areas where their factories and workplaces were located. We didn't have the transportation systems and highways we have, so people had to live near where they worked. So we didn't really live in suburbs. It wasn't a way that the country had developed thus far. But the federal government stepped in to meet this housing demand by creating suburbs all over the country. One famous example of this is Levittown outside of New York City. Levittown is an example I'll describe, but it's not very different from how suburbs all around the country were created. So Levittown was built by a developer named William Levitt. He decided he wanted to meet the demand for housing in New York City by building 17,000 homes, building a new suburb, a new town with 17,000 homes. 17,000 homes is a lot of homes to build at one time. He didn't have the money to finance that endeavor. He couldn't get a bank loan because, again, we weren't a suburban economy, so banks thought that was too speculative to loan to him. He didn't have buyers lined up. People weren't already living in suburbs. It just seemed kind of crazy. So the only way he could get the money he needed to build Levittown was through a federally backed loan guarantee from the Federal Housing Administration. And the FHA would give William Levitt this loan guarantee if he promised to put racially restrictive covenants on the deeds of the homes he built that said that the homes could only ever be owned or occupied by whites. So this is obviously explicit government policy. It was written in the FHA manual for FHA appraisers who went around the country deciding if a potential suburb or subdivision was a good investment for the federal government. And those appraisers were told that if the development was located anywhere near where African Americans lived, it wasn't a good candidate for government subsidies because it would, and I quote from the manual, run the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. So this wasn't an accident. It wasn't by private choice or private action. This was explicit government policy written in the manuals. It wasn't hidden. They weren't shy about it. So another example in Color of Law, there's a photo of a wall. It's 6 feet high and a half-mile long. It was required to be built by a developer of a subdivision in Detroit who wanted federal financing to build that subdivision. And the FHA required that he build that wall to separate his subdivision from a nearby African-American neighborhood. And that was the only way he could get that financing. So examples like this are, over and over throughout the Color of Law, throughout our history, of how the federal government explicitly required and explicitly ensured that blacks and whites lived apart from each other. So William Levitt, he was a bigot and he wasn't shy about it. At the time, he said that if he was left to his own devices, he wouldn't have sold his homes to African Americans. But the point is that he wasn't left to his own devices. And if the federal government had lived up to its constitutional obligation and told William Levitt that, look, we'll give you this financing if you promise, if you agree to sell your homes on a non-discriminatory basis, well, Levittown would look very different than it does today. Levittown today has a population that's 2% African American in a surrounding area that's 13% African American. So that disparity goes back to the policies that were in place when Levittown was built and the policies that were required by the federal government. Now, one reason that Levittown still looks the way it does is because of the sort of ongoing impacts of those policies that created segregation, even though those policies are no longer in effect. So here's how one way that works. So when Levittown was built, the homes were pretty affordable to working class families of any race. They cost about $100,000 in today's money. So a family with 1 or 2 working adults could easily get a mortgage for $100,000. If they were veterans, if they were white veterans, they could get a VA loan with a no down payment requirement and low interest rates. If they were white but not veterans, they could get an FHA loan with also low interest rates. So the federal government was subsidizing these suburbs both on the building end and the home buyer end. So those homes, they cost $100,000 then. Today, they don't cost $100,000. They cost far more than that in suburbs all around the country, $200,000, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000, in some places over $1 million. So those white families that were subsidized and allowed to buy those homes when they were affordable, they built up equity in the increasing value of their homes. They built up wealth. They could then use that wealth to send their kids to college, to weather bouts of unemployment or medical emergencies, to enjoy their retirements, most importantly, to then hand down wealth to their children and grandchildren to buy their own homes. African Americans, on the other hand, explicitly prohibited through federal government policy from accumulating wealth the same way. So that leads us to where we are today, where we have an income gap between Black and white households, which is problematic and concerning in and of itself and something to address in another talk, perhaps another book. But so the income gap is about 60%. So average African-American household income is about 60% of average white household income. You would think that 2 households that earn about the same amount of money could save about the same amount of money, so that the wealth gap should look about the same as the income gap. But the average African-American household wealth is 5% of average white household wealth across the country. That's a huge disparity, hugely problematic. And it goes back to these policies that allowed and actually subsidized whites to build up wealth while explicitly prohibiting African Americans from doing the same through home ownership. So this is the ways that even though the policies that were in place when segregation was created have been changed. You know, in 1968, we had the Fair Housing Act that prohibits the future discrimination in the sale and rental of housing, which is good, but it doesn't do anything to address this disparity, this wealth disparity that exists today. And that's why Levittown looks the way it does still, because it's one thing to say, you know, African Americans, you can buy on a non-discriminatory basis in Levittown now, when they don't have the intergenerational wealth that whites have to be able to afford those homes. So that's how we're continuing to live with the consequences of segregation. So aside from the wealth gap, segregated neighborhoods that we live in are, you know, they underlie many of our most serious social problems and most serious racial inequities in our country today. Because of segregated neighborhoods, we have disparities in health outcomes between Black and white children, income outcomes, educational outcomes, incarceration rates, exposure to violence and crime, exposure to police contact. Children who grow up in segregated African-American neighborhoods, they grow up to have higher rates of cancer, higher rates of cardiovascular disease, and shorter life expectancies. So these are serious consequences. We're not, you know, talking about a benign separation of people where some people live here and some people live here and everybody's happy. You know, it's also a segregation of resources. So those African-Americans who were limited to living in segregated African-American neighborhoods were limited to living in neighborhoods with fewer resources and more pollution and such, and you know, less well-resourced schools, so they have worse outcomes throughout their lives. So these are serious consequences we continue to live with and deal with as a result of the government policies that created and perpetuated segregation. So, excuse me. So, in 2017, my dad wrote The Color of Law. Many people read it. And, many more people than anybody expected to have read it. And as a result, the de facto segregation idea has slightly less currency in the country today. There's more conversations, more reckoning with the true history of how we came to be a segregated society. We can more clearly see how the government policies that were behind creating segregation, and we can more clearly see the consequences of that in how we live today, the costs of those policies and that segregation. And so we can more clearly see our obligation to do something to remedy it. But again, nobody has stepped up to that obligation. And we think it's because we don't really know what to do about it. And so my dad, when he wrote The Color of Law, and he came here, and as well as places all around the country, and gave lectures like this one, and many people came up to him afterwards. I was one of those people, went to one of his lectures, came up to him afterwards and said, it's amazing that you've documented all of this history, and I hear the call to action in the book that we have an obligation to step up to, but what do we do about it? It's not clear how we can go from that obligation to clear, effective action to challenge and remedy segregation. So he, in dad fashion, sort of turned the question around on me and challenged me to help him answer that question, answer my own question, I suppose, and help him write a book to answer it. So that's what we did. In Just Action, we give dozens of examples of policies and strategies that local groups can take on to begin to redress the segregation in their communities. I'll go into a few of those examples in a minute, but first, sort of the context that we set up in Just Action is that in order to live up to this obligation around the country, we need to build a new activated civil rights movement all around the country that can take on these issues and begin to challenge and redress segregation. It might seem like we're a little more, a couple years ago, it seemed like we were a little more on our way to that than we had been. In 2020, we had a racial reckoning after George Floyd's murder. 20 million people around the country marched in Black Lives Matter demonstrations. It's more people than have marched in racial justice demonstrations in our country's history. It's a lot of people, and it seemed like, something new was gonna happen. But then a lot of people who marched in those marches went home and they put up lawn signs on their front lawns saying Black Lives Matter. They maybe started book clubs, or they went back to their companies where their companies hired diversity, equity, and inclusion officers and wrote letters to their shareholders promising to do better and denouncing racism. But not much happened, not much then came to change in how our communities operate and how we continue to perpetuate segregation on the local level or the national level. And that's because, all of these actions, lawn signs, book clubs, letters to shareholders, they're good for raising awareness, for inspiring, people to think about these issues, but then we need to go a step further and take action to actually address the causes and consequences of segregation. Not saying that it'll be easy to do so, but we are arguing in Just Action that it's not impossible, and we focus very purposefully on local action that we can take, because even though the federal government was one of the main drivers of creating segregation, once created, it's perpetuated by local policy to a large degree, local policies and programs that we can change on the local level, and that would take us a long way to beginning to challenge segregation. So we also understand that federal policy will be necessary eventually. We'll need massive federal interventions and investments to make the needed changes nationally in terms of segregated neighborhoods. But we also understand that we just don't have that kind of political will on the federal level to make those kinds of changes right now. But we can build that political will in our own communities, with our own neighbors, in our own cities and towns, and begin to address these local policies and programs that perpetuate segregation, and begin to make change, and begin to build a national movement that can then bubble up to federal policy change. So how do we start this new national civil rights movement that starts on the local level? Well, we argue that we need to begin by building biracial, multi-ethnic groups in our own communities that are ready, willing to take on these issues. We understand that that in itself can seem daunting because, we, in this generation, we have less social contact with people of other races than previous generations. Because we live in such racially segregated neighborhoods, we don't just naturally come in social contact with people who don't look like us in many of our neighborhoods. So sometimes in the workplace we do develop cross-race relationships, but outside of that, it doesn't naturally occur for the most part. But that's not to say it's impossible. And in Just Action, we give examples of communities, groups that have taken some intentional steps to bring people together from other race parts of town to start to build social relationships and some social capital. And with that, those relationships, learning that they have a lot in common, that they're not that different, learning about how their neighborhoods are different, how different parts of town have different access to resources, and then they can start to address the reasons for that and the consequences of that. And if we have time in the Q&A, I can give some of those examples because they're great stories, but I'm gonna keep going through everything I wanna say now. So once these groups start, often they begin when homeowners discover that there are racially restrictive covenants on the deeds of their own homes. So we give some examples in Just Action from Modesto, California, Charlottesville, Virginia, another city I'm blanking on. But in these places, homeowners discovered these racially restrictive covenants on the deeds of their own homes, the ones that said that the home can only ever be owned or occupied by whites. So those covenants are no longer legally enforceable, but they remain on the deeds of homes forever. They're part of the legal documentation for that property. And so people have discovered these on the deeds of their own homes, and they've been shocked to see how intentionally their community, their own home was segregated. And this can then inspire people to action. These groups then developed campaigns. They enlisted high school students or crowdsourced programs to document and inventory all of the racially restrictive covenants in their towns, and created maps and educational campaigns to show their neighbors and the residents of their communities how intentionally their community was segregated. Because again, once we see how intentional action created segregation, we can start to see that intentional action can begin to undo it. It gives us some agency back in this equation. So when we talk about the strategies and policies that local groups can take on, these strategies and policies we talk about are to redress segregation. We use the term redress to mean two things, both to challenge those policies, change the policies that continue to perpetuate and maintain segregated communities. So we need to change that going forward so we don't continue to create and maintain segregation. And we also need to look backwards and address the disparities that exist because of past government policies and because of the segregation that we've lived with for so long. So disparities like that wealth gap I talked about. We can't sort of redress segregation and build an equitable society unless we do both of those things. So the policies and strategies we discuss cover both of those goals. They also fit into two sort of categories. And the first category is strategies that are concerned with increasing investments in lower income segregated African American communities, where the concentration of poverty is the direct result of government sponsored segregation. So like I said, segregation wasn't just a separation of people, but a segregation of resources. So segregated African American communities have been deprived of resources. And in order to redress segregation, we want to make those communities places of higher resources, higher opportunity. And we know that once that happens in communities, lower income communities, once resources start to be invested in those communities, people with higher incomes, often whites, want to move in, and they price out the longtime residents of those communities. We call this gentrification, happens all over the country. It's somewhat inevitable when you increase investments in a lower income community. But that's not to say that we should accept it entirely. There's lots of strategies that can prevent some of the displacement that occurs. So any strategies that are concerned with increasing investments in these communities should be coupled with anti-displacement strategies like protections for renters against rapidly increasing rents, rent regulation or rent control, protections for renters against unjust evictions, which are called just cause eviction ordinances, right to counsel programs for tenants facing evictions that give them a right to an attorney to representation in eviction court, or inclusionary zoning programs is another strategy that does sort of prevent some displacement. And inclusionary zoning is, again, a policy adopted by a local city council, and it's in the zoning code. And it requires that when new market rate housing is built, and often this happens in a gentrifying community, when new market rate housing is built, that a certain percentage of the units have to be sold or rented at affordable prices to lower and moderate income households. So it ensures that as new development happens in these communities, some of that new development is affordable to the longtime residents of those communities. Now, we argue that on top of that, in order to really ensure that these are anti-displacement strategies and don't just resegregate the community, that those new units should have preferences on them for the African Americans who are at risk of displacement, or for people who've been longtime residents of the community and who are being priced out. So one example of this type of strategy of increasing investments in lower income segregated communities and preventing displacement is investing in or expanding a land trust. So I believe that there's a land trust here in Kansas City, is that right? Yes. Is it pretty active? Does anybody know?
Fairly new, so there's
Fairly
one
new.
that's a senior,
Okay,
but there's another one that's been built in the urban core,
okay.
but it's fairly new.
Mm-hmm.
And, yeah.
Okay, yeah, that's great. So there's a newish one here. And so how land trusts work, there's over 300 communities around the country that have a land trust. If you want to know more about them, there's a great organization called Grounded Solutions that has like toolkits and lots of resources about land trusts on their website, the Grounded Solutions Network. So land trusts are concerned with creating permanently affordable home ownership opportunities in communities where housing prices are rising and preventing some displacement that's occurring in those communities. And how it does that is a land trust will acquire property in those communities, often through the local government donating vacant properties to the land trust. And then it'll fix up or build houses on those properties and sell those homes at affordable prices to lower or moderate income households. And it can sell them at affordable prices because in the sale, the land trust retains ownership of the land underneath the house. The rising cost of land is one of the reasons housing costs rise so quickly. So by taking the land cost out of the equation, the house cost is more affordable. And in return for this affordable price, the homeowner, they own the home like any other homeowner does, and they like ground lease the land from the land trust for maybe $1 a year or something negligible. And then when they want to resell the home, they have to adhere to a maximum resale price that the land trust establishes using a formula, and every land trust sort of has a different formula. It's indexed to inflation or change in median income in the neighborhood. But every land trust tries to, in that formula, balance two goals that are competing goals, so it's tricky. But they want to allow the home selling family, that original family, to build up some equity in the home sale. It won't be as much equity as if they were selling it for a market price, because it's a restricted price that they can sell it for. And that's because the other goal is they want to make sure that the home price is affordable to the next home buying family. So they can ensure this ongoing, in perpetuity, affordable home ownership opportunity. And those home selling families, they earn some equity in the sale, not as much as if it were a market rate home, but they do earn some. And so they balance those two goals. So we talk about in Just Action, the Durham Community Land Trust in Durham, North Carolina. And it was started in a lower income, predominantly African American neighborhood in Durham, when some neighbors of that neighborhood, residents of that neighborhood, they started to talk to each other, going door to door, about what they could do to improve conditions in their neighborhood. And they first identified that they wanted to get the city to turn a vacant lot in their area into a park, because they didn't have a park and there was no safe place for kids to play, and a child had been hit by a car. And they wanted to do something about that. The city had promised to turn this lot into a park and hadn't fulfilled that promise. So they advocated and they organized and got the city to turn that vacant lot into a park. And they won their first campaign, and they were excited and galvanized and thinking about what else they could do to help their neighborhood. Their neighborhood was gentrifying, and so they learned about a land trust and they started one. They started with 2 vacant properties that the city donated to them. And they built up the houses on it. They sold them to low and moderate income households for $100,000 in today's money, so an affordable price. Now the land trust there has over 300 properties all around the city. They have both rental and home ownership properties, And their home ownership properties, because of that equation that they use, they now sell for $150,000. So the affordability has gone down some as the price has gone up to allow those home selling families to earn some equity in the sales. But the homes around in the neighborhood where the land trust operates sell for $500,000. So they're far more affordable than the market rate homes in that neighborhood. And in the blocks where the land trust has acquired property, most of the residents are still African American. In the surrounding blocks where investors have outpaced the land trust in being able to buy up and accumulate property, most of the residents are now white. So we can see how this example of a land trust, and many across the country are similar, is a successful strategy for creating permanently affordable homeownership opportunities and preventing displacement that occurs when a community is gentrifying. So with this example, what can we do in our own communities? Well, there's a land trust here that is fairly new and could probably use support. So we can support a land trust personally, with our own resources or time, volunteering. But most importantly is always what we can do collectively. And that is advocating that our local governments donate vacant land to a land trust. Local governments all across the country are sitting on vacant land. And they could easily donate some of that to a land trust to create these home ownership opportunities. Another thing we could do is those restrictive covenants I talked about, that remain on the deeds of homes forever. Those deeds often name the companies that were involved with the first building and selling of that home. So the bank that first financed the home, the realtor that first sold it, the builder, the developer that first built it. And those companies are often, surprisingly, still in business in our cities. And if they're not in business, they've been acquired by another company that is. And we looked into this in the Charlottesville example. Of those four, the bank, the realtor, the developer, and the builder, most of them, I think 3 are still in business and 1 had been acquired by another company. So they're still operating in Charlottesville. A group in that city that was organized for the redress of segregation could point out to all of those companies that released statements on their websites in 2020 about supporting Black Lives Matter and supporting racial justice, that this is a way that they could show up to do that and to remedy the effects of the actions that their company took in the past in creating segregated communities. And one way they could contribute to that remedy is by contributing to a land trust, helping a land trust increase its portfolio of properties in their community. So that's one example, and that's the first category is, investing in lower income segregated communities and preventing some displacement. The other category that we talk about is opening up exclusive, expensive, usually predominantly white suburban communities to diverse residents. There's a lot of ways to do that: subsidies, down payment assistance, zoning reform to ensure that those suburban communities can build a diversity of housing types, not just only single family homes on large lots, but different sizes of homes with a range of affordability options for them. Inclusionary zoning also would be a great strategy in suburban communities. A land trust also would be. So we often talk about land trusts as operating in urban areas or in lower income communities, and that's because that's where they can usually acquire property. But if a land trust could acquire property in a suburban community, it would be an excellent strategy, an excellent way of creating permanently affordable homeownership opportunities in those communities for people who've historically been excluded from those communities. So the only thing stopping them is acquiring land. So a group in a suburban community organized for the redress of segregation could also advocate that their local suburban government donate vacant land to a land trust. And again, this is not something that is impossible. Suburban governments also are sitting on vacant land all over the country. In a lot of suburbs, public school enrollment is declining, and so there are vacant school sites that local governments are sitting on and wondering what to do with. We wrote about in Just Action, Woodbridge, Connecticut, had a country club that went out of business and the town acquired the land. And so now the land owns a huge piece of land. The town owns a huge piece of land that was a country club. They could donate part of that to a land trust to create some permanently affordable home ownership opportunities. In Modesto, California, a golf club went out of business and the city now owns it. So there's opportunities like this all over the country. with the right advocacy of local residents and constituents of those elected officials advocating for this, they could donate some of that land to a land trust to create these permanently affordable homeownership opportunities. And then, of course, we argue those should then have preferences on them to ensure that it's actually a tool for desegregation and not just creating affordable homeownership for people who've always been able to live in those communities. So another example of a strategy to open up exclusive communities has to do with the Section 8 program. So the Section 8 program is a federally funded rental subsidy program for low-income families. It's funded by the federal government through HUD and administered by local public housing authorities. Over 2 million low-income families around the country get Section 8. That's a fraction, it's a quarter of those that are eligible. That's also another issue to take on another time. That's a federal funding issue. But 2 million families is a lot. They're disproportionately African-American families. And the promise of the Section 8 program, one of the intentions when it was created was to allow low-income families mobility opportunities, so the ability to move out of low-income, high-poverty neighborhoods. So unlike public housing recipients whose benefit comes with a place, with a Section 8 voucher, families can use that voucher to rent anywhere in the private market. And so in theory, they could use those vouchers to rent in higher opportunity neighborhoods, which are neighborhoods with well-resourced public schools and access to open space and grocery stores and banks and transportation and jobs. Only 5% of Section 8 voucher holders live in these kinds of neighborhoods. There's a lot of reasons for that. One is discrimination, plain and simple. It is legal on the federal level to discriminate against a tenant because they use Section 8 to pay their rent. So it's legal to say, no Section 8, I won't accept you if you use Section 8 to pay your rent. There's about 20 states and over 100 cities and counties that have outlawed that kind of discrimination with laws called source of income discrimination laws. Those are locally passed laws that make it illegal to discriminate against Section 8 tenants. So there is not such a law here. I think there's only 3 cities in Missouri, 1 in Kansas that has a source of income discrimination law, so that's something that a local group could help pass. And then once passed, those laws are only as good as their enforcement and their monitoring. So, and that work often falls to fair housing organizations and civil rights organizations. So we can support those organizations to do the work that's necessary to tease out where discrimination is occurring when it is outlawed, and then to prosecute and make sure that discrimination is, those anti-discrimination laws are enforced. One way to do that is to volunteer with a fair housing organization to be a tester. And that's how these organizations send paired testers, so 2 people who are posing as potential tenants with similar qualifications, different races. Some say they use Section 8 and some say they don't. And then you can see how they're treated, who's offered the unit and who's told that it's already been rented. That's how we find out where discrimination is happening so that those anti-discrimination laws can be enforced. These fair housing organizations need volunteers to be able to do that kind of testing. So that's another way we can contribute to remedies. So that's one example. There's more I could go into on the Section 8 issue. If you're interested in that in the Q&A, I can go into that in more detail. I'll just go into one more quick example, and that is, we have these 2 sort of categories, but then there's also strategies that span both of the categories, and those often include strategies that increase home ownership opportunities for African Americans in every type of neighborhood, down payment assistance programs, home buyer education and counseling, favorable mortgages, and reforming the credit scoring system. So the credit scoring system is a system that is racially neutral on its face. It's not a racially discriminatory, at least explicitly, policy or program, but it's racially discriminatory in effect. And here's why. So we think about the credit scoring system as an objective rating of our future likelihood of repaying a debt. It's an algorithm, so it must be true. It's based on your past financial history. So if you've defaulted on a loan in the past, a bank might think you're more likely to default in the future, so you'll have a lower credit score. It'll be harder to get a mortgage. If you have too low of a credit score, you can't get a mortgage. If you have a high credit score, you can get a mortgage. You could get a lower interest rate if your score is high enough. So we think that this is a fair system. But it's not, and it's not because it's only based on a certain type of financial history. And it's a type of financial history that whites are far more likely to have than African Americans. Several reasons for that. One is that African American neighborhoods of all socioeconomic levels have fewer bank branches than white neighborhoods of similar socioeconomic status. And that's because of the financial redlining that banks do in terms of where they place their services. So if you live in a neighborhood that doesn't have a bank, you might be more likely to use a non-traditional financial institution like a payday lender. If you borrow from a payday lender and pay back that loan in full, even with their exorbitant interest rates, that faithful payment history isn't reflected in your credit score. It doesn't get factored into your credit score. Only if you've borrowed from a bank or a credit card is that debt factored into your credit score. Another reason is that if you've had a mortgage in the past and you've paid it off, you've paid it on time, paid your payments on time, that does benefit you in your credit score. And whites who are applying for a mortgage are more likely to have had a mortgage in the past than African Americans. If you haven't had a mortgage in the past and you've been a renter your whole life, paid your rent on time, never missed a rent payment, never missed a utility bill payment, that doesn't factor into your credit score either. And so this is why we have the system that we have today, which is that the credit scoring system seems to be racially neutral, but it's racially discriminatory in effect. So the result is that about a third of African Americans have no credit score at all. They just don't have the kind of financial history that can create a credit score, compared to about 17% of whites. And of those with credit scores, about half of whites have credit scores high enough to qualify them for a mortgage, compared to about 20% of African Americans. So this is the disparity, the discriminatory effect of this system. So the credit scoring system is a national system. There's talk on the national level of changing it and factoring in rental payment history. It's starting to happen. It's been a conversation that's been going on for 15 years. So it's just starting, like this year. So if we wait for federal policy change, we'll be waiting for a long time, but there's no reason we have to wait. We can work with our local financial institutions and banks and get them to start factoring in rental payment history into their own algorithms for rating credit and for determining who's a good mortgage applicant. And we give some examples of in Just Action of bank branches that are doing that independently. So it's not impossible. It's a little bit harder to collect that information, but certainly not impossible. And once banks do that, once that is factored into a credit score, African Americans' credit scores, get a huge boost, and it opens up home ownership opportunities in a huge way for the African American community. So this is another thing we can do to begin to redress segregation in our own communities. So those are a few examples. There's many, many more in the book. There's a lot more we couldn't fit in the book. There's a lot more I keep learning about since we wrote the book. So we have a column on Substack. It's justaction.substack.com. It's like a free newsletter. You can sign up there. We're continuing to write about these issues as we learn about them, to update what we wrote about in the book, and to give some success stories of communities working on these issues around the country. So you can check us out there. And now I will stop talking and listen to your questions and hopefully answer some of them before we have to wrap up.
Quick reminder, if you have a question, please step up to the microphone so the folks watching at home can hear the question as well as the answer. And I'm actually going to start with a question from somebody watching at home. For the low-income families, as they are disproportionately African-American and historically placed in high-crime areas, are there any recommendations in the book for addressing that?
Well, yeah, the whole book is about how to create more opportunities for people to leave lower-income neighborhoods, African Americans to leave those neighborhoods and move to higher opportunity neighborhoods if they wish, and also to make those lower income neighborhoods of higher opportunity, of less sort of divestment of resources. We do talk about ban the box ordinances that can help make it easier for those with criminal records to rent on the private market. And because we have a discriminatory criminal justice system, African Americans are more likely to have something on their criminal record. Whether or not it's real or resulted in a conviction, it can prevent someone from being able to rent a unit for the rest of their lives. And if we don't address that and make it easier for folks to get safe and stable housing, sort of get out of this cycle. So that's something we can do to help those communities. And yeah, so we address some of those issues around crime and over-policing in those neighborhoods, including in schools. Schools in segregated African-American communities are more likely to discipline their students through the criminal justice system than through administrative or sort of more reform-minded ways. And so that's also something that needs to be addressed to get out of this cyclical kind of school to prison pipeline issue.
I'll jump in with another one from somebody watching at home then while we queue up. Somebody wants to know with the land trust, any tips for ensuring that local governments will not repeat the problems of the past in terms of street maintenance and upkeep in these neighborhoods and making sure that it's done in an equitable fashion?
In terms of a land trust, well, the land trust usually, has properties spread out throughout the neighborhood. So, and they have active boards. Their board of directors usually include, they're usually about half residents of their units and half professionals in the local community, lawyers or housing professionals. And so by having an organization that is focused on these neighborhoods and ensuring these neighborhoods are high quality neighborhoods and safe places for people to live, with active boards and active membership, it can help, sort of create the needed advocacy that is necessary to ensure that the city serves the neighborhoods in the same way as other neighborhoods.
I grew up in the 50s and 60s, and when Lyndon Johnson came out with the Great Society, that ruined a whole bunch of things for black neighborhoods, Negro neighborhoods, whatever the right word is. And now, so many households are unmarried adults, and that complicates being able to even, because you can't combine your incomes, you can't do this, you can't do that. And all the role models when I was a kid were within 5 blocks, but now they all went to the suburbs because, for financial reasons. Mm-hmm. So I was wondering what we could do to fix it so that unmarried households can get the same rights as married households.
Yeah, that's a good question. So that is a federal policy question in terms of IRS policy. And so we sort of stay away from the federal policy change because it feels a little too difficult right now to address that. But there are communities doing interesting things around helping sort of unrelated households buy property together. So buy small, duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, to be able to create some equity for themselves and be able to get into home ownership without having to be able to afford an entire building on your own. So that's a interesting way of doing it. There's co-housing also does that, or tenant opportunity to purchase acts, which are acts that local governments can pass that require that when a landlord wants to sell a building that's occupied by tenants, that the tenants have the first opportunity to bid on it and can go in on it together to purchase it. I don't know that I believe New York has a version of that. Washington, D.C. is looking at passing it. So it's fairly new, that idea. There's also some talk about helping lower income and moderate income families buy multi-unit buildings where, it might be a duplex where they can live in one and rent one out to earn some rental income. So there are creative ways to address the issue of, it being hard for unmarried people to buy property on their own together, and staying away from sort of the tax issues on the federal level. There's stuff we can do locally to just create more opportunity for creative financing and for diverse, home ownership styles and diverse housing stock. So we, in order to do many of the things I just talked about, we need a community that doesn't just have single-family homes. We need also to have duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, in order to achieve some of these goals. So it's a multi-step process in some ways.
I'll ask something while she goes up. Oh, you were quick. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Locally, a lot of our housing work is funded by local foundations and philanthropy. Did you look at best practices for that across the country? Like, how are different foundations investing in ending segregation or redressing segregation and explicitly addressing racism, and, you know, whether it's their practices or just historic practices in the city?
Yeah, that's a good question. A lot of the things I talked about rely on foundation funding, land trusts, fair housing centers, the Section 8 program. You know, there's also mobility programs where often fair housing centers or housing organizations help provide sort of comprehensive services to help Section 8 tenants find and acquire units in higher opportunity areas, and those mobility programs are usually funded by foundations. So I think foundations, like learning about what the issues are in the community that are obstacles to desegregation and what the challenges are. And I also think that funding organizing is extremely important, because the ways any of this is going to happen, you know, I keep stressing that a local group needs to work on these issues and advocate that their local government make these changes, or that local institutions support these changes. All of that relies on local residents being organized and activated and working on these issues, and that requires, you know, trained organizers to help them do that. And that's a big gap in kind of the funding and the just landscape of how we make these changes. There's a group, a national group that was formed that came out of the Color of Law, actually, called the Redress Movement. It's the redressmovement.org, and it's a fairly new organization, but they're placing organizers in communities around the country to help start, you know, help to support local groups that want to take on these issues. So they now have organizers in Denver, Charlotte, and Milwaukee, and so that's another thing that a foundation could support to help them get more organizers around the country.
So I was really impressed with the fact that you dedicated so much of your book to redressing the harms that have happened historically in housing and, you know, other aspects of the law, and how our federal and state governments played a role. And so thanks for this website now to go and check that out. But one of the things that we're facing all over the country, here in Kansas City and in city after city, is homelessness. And I didn't read your book all the way through yet, so I don't know if you decided to tackle that issue too, but I see a through line with respect to you know, the racial segregation and racial, you know, and the impacts of racism with regards to federal, you know, and state policy and individual policy, you know, where there's banking institutions, realtors and so forth, across the board. But I see that through line also bringing us to the moment that we're all dealing with homelessness. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, we don't delve into that question much in the book. It's a huge issue, and you know, rapidly becoming even bigger all across the country, as you all know. And I think, you know, a lot of the solutions that we advocate for will help with homelessness. They're not directly addressed at homelessness, but in order to get out of the housing crisis that we're in, that you know, trickles down to create homelessness the way it has, is to build more housing, and to build more housing that's accessible to all income levels. So not just very expensive market rate and subsidized low income, but also middle income housing for middle income families that earn too much to qualify for subsidized housing and too little to be able to afford market rate housing. Because when those people, lose a job or have a health emergency and there's no housing they can fall back on, that adds to the homelessness issue. So we need to be building more housing, we need to be subsidizing more people to get into rental and home ownership. And a lot of the, I mentioned a right to counsel program, so that's a program where local governments fund, a right to legal representation in eviction court for lower income tenants facing evictions. Evictions are another road to homelessness, especially when you have an eviction on your record, it then becomes nearly impossible to rent in the future. So by having free legal representation, these tenants often can avoid getting that on their record and avoid getting evicted, most importantly, but also even if they don't want to stay in the unit for whatever reason, they won't have that eviction on their record. So a lot of these strategies can help with that issue. And I would like to write a Substack column for our column about homelessness, and I'm still trying to dig my way through what the answers are. Thank you.
I think we'll go over here, and then if there's one more question, if somebody wants to queue up over here, we'll end with that one.
Okay.
Well, thank you, and I should preemptively say that I have not had a chance to read your book, so my apologies if this is mentioned in it. But we are locally in Kansas City, in the metro area, we're situated in a very unique place where you have two states, right, that have policies, different municipalities and cities. And so while these ideas that, we have kind of been touching on this evening kind of get us jump-started to, redress the processes of, intentional, disinvestment and segregation across the country. These same municipalities and policies keep kind of reinventing themselves and in a way kind of take us back over and over and over. So like here in Kansas City, while, the city has subsidized private large-scale, out-of-town firms and apartments, and while they save, a certain percent of affordable housing is not necessarily, low-income housing. So that keeps people out. Out in the Kansas suburbs, for example, you have laws that have prohibited people cohabitating who are not family members. You have, Prairie Village, which is, fighting rezoning, even for multifamily housing that is, slated for $60,000 a year, right? That's not low-income housing, right? So, so what I'm getting at is that at least, these state and local policies across the board keep reinventing themselves, right, and preventing from actually redressing the problem. So my question is, did any of the examples that you mentioned in the book, tackle, how local communities, right, and organizers have been attempting to dismantle these policies and keep them from reinventing themselves again?
Yeah, so I like to think of this sort of, what created segregation wasn't one thing. It was many actors and government agencies and institutions and policies and practices. And what's going to undo it isn't going to be one thing that then we do it and we're done. It's going to be one little piece here, and then it's going to get overturned, and then one little piece here. And, it's going to be a continuous effort. And that's why building a movement that can then, continue to advocate for those changes and continue to fight when those changes try to get overturned, we're not just going to pass one thing and be done with the issue. So, I try to stress that it's going to be a continuous effort, that it's going to take a lot of smaller incremental steps and then defending those steps. And we do talk in the book about opposing the opposers, or how to counter NIMBY opposition. So NIMBYs are not in my backyard. They're people who say that they support affordable housing until it's proposed in their own neighborhood. They're often so vehemently opposed to any new housing development, whether it's affordable or not, if it's just denser than their single family homes, or if they think that it'll change the quote unquote character of their neighborhood. They show up to all the planning meetings and city council meetings, and they can delay approval of a development or make that approval impossible. So they've blocked housing development all over the country. And what we argue is that there is as much support for these new developments and these changes in these communities likely as there is opposition, but the supporters don't turn out because they don't come to the planning meetings the way that the opposers do, because the people opposed think that they're going to be personally impacted. Now, their beliefs about how they're going to be personally negatively impacted by new housing in their neighborhood often don't, they're not true, they don't come to pass, but they believe that they're going to be personally harmed, so they're very motivated to show up. And the people who support this, are kind of like, yeah, I think it would be a good thing, but they're not as personally invested. And we need to be as personally invested with opening up our communities to diverse residents, to inclusion, to creating affordable housing opportunities, to making our communities look the way we want them to look, and then show up and be as vocal in our support of these changes as the opposers are in their opposition. And I wrote a column for our Substack about a group in Silicon Valley in California that is kind of like not what you would expect, the kind of community that would defeat NIMBYs, but they did. They defeated a ballot measure that would have stopped 90 units of teacher housing, housing affordable for teachers because they couldn't afford to live in that community either. And so the opposers put a measure on the ballot that would have blocked that and blocked any future rezoning efforts to create housing. And these people who created an organization, actually after they made a presentation about, based on the color of law, about how their own community came to be segregated, created an organization that understood that this backlash against this one housing development was, one in a series of all of the policies that have created the housing affordability crisis in their community and created the exclusivity and the racial makeup of their community, and didn't want to stand for it, so they launched a campaign and they defeated the ballot measure. So Silicon Valley can do it, then we can find supporters in our communities, and we just have to be as invested in the positive changes as the opposers are in stopping them.
Hi, my name is Luan, and thank you so much, for taking your time to, present all this wonderful information. And I haven't had the opportunity to read your book yet, but I've read your dad's book, which is a great, phenomenal book. And I know there's two questions that I have. The first is, I understand that one of the solutions that was proposed is to get a diverse range from, of residents to, come together and discuss these topics, these issues. Do you, in your book or in your website, present ideas on how to get that started?
We do, yeah.
Okay, so
question.
I'll definitely check that out because, sometimes it's, I think, very difficult to pull people, especially if they're not directly impacted, like you mentioned. And I know the second one, one of the other solutions you proposed was investments. So I don't know if you covered this, but what about reparations? What is your viewpoint on that? Okay,
two big questions. I'll try to answer them quickly. So the first one, we do give examples, a couple just brief overviews of those examples. One photographer in Chicago created this photography project where she folded the map of the city in half. So the white neighborhood and the black neighborhood were on top of each other when the map was folded in half, and identified the map twin houses because Chicago's a perfect grid. So when the map is folded in half, houses have the same number on the north and south side of the street. Introduced the map twin residents to each other from the white and black side of town. And they created relationships and toured each other's neighborhoods and learned about each other's neighborhoods and created block twins, and now have, social networks that span the other race side of town where they never had been before, many of them, even though they lived in Chicago their whole lives. In another community in Winston-Salem, churches of the same denomination, but there were 3 white churches and 3 African-American. They created a discussion group that had to have equal racial balance. So there's ways it's not necessarily easy, you know, because we don't just necessarily run into people of other races at the grocery store in many of our communities. So it takes these intentional efforts, but it's possible, you know, starting with a church, through a church or a local community organization, or like an artist like this woman, Tanika Johnson in Chicago, just creating some way of bringing people together to start to build those relationships. So that's your first question. The second question, the reparations question. So we don't use the term reparations in our book, and there's a couple reasons for that, but we do, I think, use the sentiment a lot, and that we call it remedies. We think that we need remedies to address the harms of the past and start to make things right. The issue, the problematic, or the risk we have in using the term reparations is that if you call a program a reparation, you can then think that we're done. Well, we've repaired it, you know, we can wash our hands of it, we've made this one payout or whatever the program is. And we believe that true repair is gonna be many, many different programs, changing policies, changing laws, providing remedies. It's not just gonna be one thing. But I am really, I don't know, hopeful about all of the conversations about reparations. You know, when my dad wrote The Color of Law, he had there's a frequently asked question at the back about reparations. And I think his answer was, you know, we're so far away from reckoning with the true history of how we got here, how can we even talk about reparations? And so now we you know, 7 years later, so-ish, 7 years later, we really have come a long way as a country in starting to talk about how we got here. So the conversations about reparations that are happening, you know, California has a task force, other cities are starting to talk about how to quantify what a reparation payment would be. I don't know that any of those programs, you know, if there's money for them or if they will come to pass, but the fact that we're reckoning with the history in a new way is, I think it's a good step in the right direction, and I hope that it then leads to true remedies and repair in the future. So with that, I think we're done, and I'll just say that with all of the examples I've given and all of the examples in the book, I hope that what's left is that there's a lot that can be done, that it is a huge problem, it feels overwhelming, but it doesn't mean that there's nothing we can do to begin to redress it, and it sort of matters very little how we start, just that we start to do something. So I hope you all take that and run with it. And thank you so much
thank you for
coming.
being here tonight. Quick reminder, the book is available outside. It's $20, tax included. If you value the type of things we're talking about tonight, you will find value in this book.
Thank you so much.